Russia didn't expect this. For months, Moscow believed India would remain its most loyal economic partner, especially when the West shut Russia out of global markets. India was the country buying millions of barrels of discounted Russian oil, fueling Russia's war budget, keeping its economy alive, and giving Moscow one lifeline when everything else collapsed. But suddenly, that lifeline just snapped. India has cut its Russian oil imports so sharply, so unexpectedly, and so aggressively that the Kremlin is now scrambling behind the scenes. The Russian state media is panicking. Traders are confused, and Moscow is facing a new crisis it never saw coming. This is the story of how India just turned off Russia's oil tap, and why this single move could reshape the global energy map. To understand why Moscow is panicking today, we need to go back to February 2022. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the West responded with massive sanctions. Europe, once Russia's biggest energy customer, abandoned Russian oil and gas almost overnight. This caused chaos in Russia's economy. Oil revenues crashed, budget deficits exploded, and Putin urgently needed a new buyer, someone big enough to replace Europe. That buyer was India. Before the war, India barely touched Russian oil, less than 1% of its imports. But after the sanctions, India saw an opportunity. Russia began selling crude at massive discounts. $30, $35, even $40 below global prices. For India, a country hungry for cheap energy, this was a dream scenario. So Indian refineries opened their doors, and Russian oil flooded in. By mid-2023, India was buying more Russian oil than Europe did before the war. Russia became India's biggest supplier, overtaking Iraq and Saudi Arabia. For Moscow, this was more than trade. It was survival. India became the economic oxygen Russia needed to keep breathing. And in the Kremlin's eyes, India was reliable, predictable, and strategically aligned. But that was then. Today, everything has changed. In the last several weeks, something happened that shocked analysts. India abruptly slashed its Russian oil imports. Not gradually, not gently, but sharply, like a financial guillotine coming down. Tankers that once lined up at Indian ports disappeared. Refineries that relied on Russian crude stopped buying. The decline was so dramatic that Russian traders began calling it the Indian freeze. So what caused this sudden break? At first glance, Moscow tried to blame seasonal changes. But insiders know the truth. India made a strategic pivot, and that pivot has shaken the Kremlin. The key reasons behind India's sudden cut include payment problems. Russia wants to be paid in yuan or rubles. India wants to pay in rupees or dollars. Neither side is budging. Result? Shipments stalled. Rising prices. Russia reduced its discounts as demand stabilized. India responded by walking away. U.S. pressure. Washington has been quietly warning Indian refineries. And this time, India listened. G7 price cap enforcement. Tankers, insurers, and shipping companies are now facing tighter restrictions. This choked the supply lines feeding India. India's desire to diversify. New Middle Eastern deals suddenly became more attractive. This wasn't a small adjustment. It was a strategic message. And Moscow got the message loud and clear. India's pullback has triggered a chain reaction inside Russia. Russian officials held emergency meetings with oil exporters. Energy oligarchs began pressing the Kremlin for clarity. And state media quietly stopped boasting about record oil exports. Behind the scenes, Moscow is terrified. Because losing India now is the nightmare scenario Russia hoped would never happen. Here's why. Russia's budget is collapsing. Oil and gas make up more than a third of government revenue. If India pulls away, Russia loses billions. The discounts will return. When no one buys Russian oil, Moscow is forced to cut prices again, hurting its economy even more. Sanction loopholes close. Without India, Russia has nowhere else to hide its crude. China won't help. China buys Russian oil, but always on China's terms. Beijing takes advantage of Moscow's desperation. India was Russia's way of balancing China. Now that balance is gone. For the Kremlin, this isn't just an oil problem. It's a strategic crisis. India did not cut Russia off out of emotion. It did so out of national interest and cold strategic calculation. Let's break down India's real motives. India wants energy security, not dependence. Indian policymakers were worried. Russia was becoming too unpredictable. Sanctions could tighten at any moment. Payment problems kept growing. India doesn't want to rely too heavily on any single supplier, especially one under global pressure. Middle Eastern suppliers offered better terms. Saudi Arabia and Iraq have been aggressively cutting prices. They want to win back the Indian market they lost to Russia. So they came with cheaper long-term deals, stable shipping routes, guaranteed payment systems for India. This was a safer bet. India wants to maintain good relations with the West. New Delhi is walking a geopolitical tightrope. It wants Russian oil, but it also wants U.S. technology, Western investment, and trade access. With American pressure rising, India chose the middle ground. Reduce Russian imports, but don't cut them entirely. Refinery economics changed. Indian refineries discovered something surprising. Russian oil wasn't always profitable. When discounts shrank, refining margins collapsed. Middle Eastern crude made more financial sense. India is preparing for the post-Ukraine world. India knows this war will end eventually. When it does, new alliances will form, and India wants to be in a strong bargaining position. Cutting Russian oil now gives India leverage later. India's decision has consequences far beyond Moscow. In fact, it reshapes the global energy map. Let's break it down. Russia will face a deeper budget crisis without India. Moscow must rely even more on China. China will demand bigger discounts, leading to lower revenues. Russia may be forced to cut social programs, raise taxes, or print more money. The G7 price cap suddenly matters again. India was helping Russia bypass Western controls. By stepping back, it makes those controls effective again. Shipping risks rise. Insurance becomes harder. Tanker networks collapse. Oil markets will shift. Middle Eastern suppliers will regain dominance. Russia will be pushed out of premium markets. Crude flows will reorganize globally. China becomes more powerful with India reducing purchases. China becomes Russia's only real customer. This gives Beijing massive leverage over Moscow. Russia becomes more dependent. China becomes the price setter. India gains diplomatic capital. The West sees India as a more reliable partner. The Middle East sees India as a major buyer again. And Russia learns that India cannot be taken for granted. India's move isn't just about oil. It's about positioning itself as a global power. Here's how this benefits India. Cheaper, more stable energy. Middle Eastern crude is easier to ship, insure, and refine. Stronger relations with the US and Europe. India shows it can cooperate when needed, without being forced. Better bargaining power with Russia by demonstrating it can walk away. India can negotiate deeper future discounts. More influence in global geopolitics. India is no longer a passive buyer. It's a decisive player shaping energy dynamics. For Moscow, the situation is grim. Russia loses its biggest post-sanctions victory. India was the proof that Russia still had global partners. That proof is gone. Budget pressure intensifies. Russia's spending is at wartime levels. Oil income keeps the war machine running. Without India, that machine slows down. China gains control. This is Putin's worst fear. Dependence on one buyer is dangerous, especially when that buyer is China. Sanctions bite harder. Loopholes close. Shipping risks increase. Revenue falls. Russia looks weak. A great power losing its biggest partner sends the wrong message, internally and globally. This crisis is still unfolding. India might continue reducing imports. Russia might be forced to slash prices again. New energy alliances will emerge. The world is watching, and the stakes are enormous. Will Russia rebuild its influence in India? Will China become Moscow's only economic lifeline? Or is this the moment the global balance of power shifts again? We don't know yet. But what we do know is that India's single decision has sent shockwaves across Moscow and the world. Thank you for watching. If you want to understand global economics, geopolitics, and the hidden forces shaping our world, make sure you subscribe. Because this story is far from over, and we'll be here to break down every twist as it happens.